Wednesday, September 11th, 2019, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studios at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, the widening ripple effects of accepting Jeffrey Epstein's money as the head of MIT's revered Media Lab steps down. Covering race at NPR, the network's news director issues a statement about the quality of the work being done there, and employees of color push back. And new guidelines for protecting women journalists from harassment online. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well before our time is up today, but I want to start with a number of books that are going to be hitting shelves, either hitting them yesterday or very soon. Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's long-awaited book on their reporting into the Harvey Weinstein saga includes the identities and stories of some women who had not previously shared their experiences publicly. And Chanel Miller announced that there's soon going to be the release of her memoir, the name of the book is Know My Name. That's imminent. Miller, we now know, is the woman we have known for the last 3-4 years as the woman who was attacked by Brock Turner, the Stanford swimmer. And she's saying, it's time that I come forward with this story, that you know who I am, what things were really like for me these past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think is going to be a compelling book because, for the long time, no one knew who she was. Mm-hmm. All they knew was what was in the court documents. And according to all reports, she's going to, in this memoir, she's going to go further into not just what people were able to see in the court documents, but her interpretations of that, because she didn't really get to see any of the court documents until they were made public later on. And then she could throw she will be putting context into that and talk about how all of that has changed who she is and where the entire situation of women and their interactions with men on not just on college campuses, but totally in how they wind up in the court system and how it works and doesn't work, at least in her situation.
Yeah, I think reminding listeners a little bit about the story, because really what made this story so infamous was the light sentence that was given to her assailant, and it was her statement, which I think at that time was anonymous, but that really caught the publisher's eye. And I think what I think we've learned from we see from this, but also from the Me Too movement, is that having a voice, giving a voice to what happened to you is power. And I think as long as victims are silent, they think it's only me, and I think that's true in all kinds of victimization. But when you get the courage to speak out, it does reveal that there are other people who are in the same boat, and that provides power to victims.
The Me Too movement has taken a bit of a hit recently. We have Billy Bush returning to television. We have Scarlett Johansson coming out and saying that she's a supporter of Woody Allen's, that she would work with him at any time. We've got David Chappelle's Netflix special in which he says he has a Me Too headache, that he's tired of hearing about it at this point. How do these books and the retelling of women's stories, how does that begin to push back at some of that attitude of like, enough already? How does it bring those voices back to the forefront?
Well, I'm not sure, because I did watch Dave Chappelle's special on that, and I've done some reading on some of this. And yes, there is this pushback, that there's this sort of backlash, which was to be expected. But I also think what's sort of missing from a lot of the conversation goes to what Kathy was talking about, which is the individual voices talking about their experience, and then looking for what are the similarities, because you're gonna see some differences in those stories, but what are the similarities, and are these things that can be exposed and things that can be worked on and talked about in a larger setting. But I think what's happening now is that people are trying to wade through the individual stories, and it's like one after another. And part of it too is that the stories allowing them to tell their stories from their lived experiences is much more influential and dramatic than a lot of the reporting you see, because a lot of the reporting is the same sort of, they hit on the same sort of things over and over again, and what's missing is that individuality, that authenticity of each woman's individual story. That gets missed because all the stories seem to read the same way.
Well, and I think, it's sort of the oldest adage of journalism. If you want people to care about an issue, you want to put a human face on it. And I think that's what a lot of this work has done. And if you think about the R. Kelly case, what really revived the case against him was these documentarians,
the Lifetime special,
who really
stories.
let the women speak.
Yeah.
And it was those women's voices, I think, that stirred the outrage and really got the law enforcement agencies back to action. So I think really for a long time in journalism, and I think it's the appropriate thing to do when you have a victim, you want to protect that victim. But at a certain point, I think victims need to start to speak out and tell their stories, because that's really, as we're discovering, is the only way to get the predators to stop.
Right.
So traditionally, the solution had been for women to tell other women what to do to protect themselves in situations like this, who to stay away from because maybe they're handsy, or who will invite you out to discuss your career over drinks or dinner with other ideas in mind. This was all advice doled out through a whisper network. Sometimes the harassers aren't the people that we're working with, however. There are sources or our audience. And this week, the Committee to Protect Journalists issued updated guidance citing online harassment as one of the biggest on-the-job threats to female journalists today.
We can't rely on just journalists. Yes, they need to take steps to protect their digital identity, to do social media hygiene, but we also need newsrooms to take this issue seriously and realize that it is endemic to certain beats. It's very likely in retaliation for certain stories, and that they need to address this proactively with their reporters, both staff and freelance. And we need the technology companies to do their part, because this is pervasive on their platforms, and it's not enough to mute or block somebody. You need to know if those threats are coming through, and we need more proactive responses from the tech platforms.
And she makes a fair challenge there, putting it back on newsrooms, also putting it back, though, on the tech platforms. But we've been talking about that on this program for years. If it was really that simple, they would have done something about it by now, or if they cared enough to.
Well, I think that's the point, if they cared enough. I mean, I think there's just a lot of trash out there, and sadly, some of our tech companies are refusing to take out the trash. It's, you make money off of those kind of interactions and keeping people on your websites. And I just got back from New Orleans, where the News Leaders Association had Maria Ressa from the Philippines speaking to them. And she said that she was getting so many threats. She said, oh yeah, Facebook told me just report them. And she said, I was getting 90 threats an hour. And if you took the time to report all of those, there's not enough hours in a day. And we're talking about things saying, one of the threats that she quoted was somebody, an actual person put this online, that she should be raped to death. So there's always been, I think, this very gendered kind of attack on women. There are a lot of people who just don't like to see women in a position of power. And by the way, some of those people are women too. But there's always been this. But I think social media has empowered it in a way that is, really something I never could have imagined. And I remember the first time I heard about this was from students. And my first reaction was just ignore it. But then I realized, that would be
it's really not that easy. And,
right,
and I say this
exactly.
with the utmost admiration for you. You are a journalist I look up to, but somebody who I think has a much thicker skin than I do. And there are times where I find myself self-censoring because I'm afraid of what people will come back at me with, if it's based on something we have on this show that's posted online, or a project that I work on, or commentary that I may offer, that sometimes even offering my professional opinion, I find myself second guessing whether I should do that out of fear of personal attack or backlash.
Yeah, I think, part of it, and we've talked about this on the show before, a huge part of it is the anonymity that these people. I
Exactly.
mean, if you go back to, when I was in journalism, and of course you have been in it just as long, you had letters to the editor, and you had to have your name on there, or they wouldn't print it. And your name was put out there, and in some cases, they actually had your address. And so that, to a certain extent, sort of kept that at bay.
Accountability. That there was accountability
Absolute accountability. But with in the social media environment, you don't have that. I mean, people can just go out and say whatever they want to say in total anonymity. And you're right, the tech companies have allowed a lot of this to happen. They keep coming back and saying, well, we're going to do a better job of policing it, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. But there's no evidence that they're doing any of that. I mean, the example that you just gave is that's every day for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. They face that kind of harassment every single day, and the tech companies aren't doing anything about it. And I think in what's happening now with the state's attorneys general going after the tech companies in large part is because of all the complaints and the fact that now you have the legislators, these attorney generals and others who have been victims of this are finally saying enough is enough.
So that's a slight pivot point to a somewhat related topic. A piece that's on our links blog that Kathy shared with me, written by Don Corrigan on the Gateway Journalism Review, about the incivility that also becomes from being a woman who's covering a state legislature that has a legislative agenda that can be very much anti-woman, and the workplace that creates when so much of what you're covering is legislation that limits the rights and access and abilities of women to be women.
Well, and I think the other point he makes is it's not even so much the issues that are being covered, because I think we're all used to covering controversial issues, but it's the idea that the language that some of the lawmakers have used, and I certainly, I remember early in my career covering a legislative conference committee, and as you probably know, these are usually in close quarters. They're members of both chambers of I think it was the Pennsylvania State Legislature. And I was sitting in a chair on the side of the room with my notebook, and one of the state senators came by and patted me on the head, like I was a little dog. So I don't think he would have done that to a man. So I think women for years have been used to being belittled. Now, that was fairly benign, but belittled and harassed. And as a journalist, you just have to take it. I mean, you're limited in how much you can respond. So I think that takes a toll on people. It does.
Yeah, but I would say this. I think you're right. There's some journalists that walk into it and go like, okay, this is to be expected. This is what I'm going to expect. But I think what you're seeing now is you're starting to see journalists push back on that, and I think that's also contributed to the adversarial relationship that you have between politicians and journalists now. And now that's even seeped into various governmental agencies, because you have now career employees in the government who now feel like they can do this because they've been given carte blanche by the political appointees to be able to do this as well. So it's not just the legislators; it's all the apparatus who now feel like you can do this, and the fact that you have journalists who are going, wait a minute, enough is enough. I mean, has to be some level of respect and decorum here, and I'm going to push back on this.
And that's at the heart of actually some work that we're going to be doing here at the School of Journalism, based on some training that I've done as part of a faculty fellowship associated with the Freedom Forum Institute's Power Shift initiative, which is really looking at how we create and then reinforce workplace cultures that really try to bring cultures of workplace integrity and mutual respect to people who have previously been denied that through generations. And one of the core principles there, is we talked about at the beginning of this segment, is how sometimes those harassers or those people who are creating those toxic environments are the sources themselves, in this case the legislators, and really thinking about how we can extend our workplace cultures to empower the person who's having their head patted in that committee meeting to come back and to speak to people who could be working in their HR department or the person to whom they report directly, and to report those instances and to begin to collectively work to shift that power and create cultures of integrity. While we're on that topic of toxic masculinity, I urge you to check out the piece that's on our links blog from the editor of Forbes magazine, in which he apologizes, sort of, for the fact that its list of the 100 most innovative business leaders had only one woman on it. His apology starts with an admission that it hit him Friday night at the reception as they were honoring all of these people, that the women were literally in the 1%, which is not necessarily good to be in the 1%. And I read that and I rolled my eyes to say, come on now, somebody didn't look at this list ahead of time, somebody didn't look at pictures, but he blamed it on an algorithm, on a formula that was used that was looking at the profitability of the companies that they represent and pushing it back on healthcare, the healthcare and the tech sectors, because those companies are growing the fastest and they don't have enough women in their leadership.
Well, I'm with you. I rolled my eyes at that too. So I'm like, but there was a story involved. Did you not look at the story to say, wait a minute, there's something missing here? And to turn around and sort of say, well, I take the blame for that, but then I'm going to blame it on the algorithm because this is something that we've been using and we've been using it in other, and to put these other lists together, and it came out looking, this way. And now we realize that there's not just women missing from here, but there are women of color missing from here, and there are other parts of our overall community that Forbes is supposed to be talking to that is not a part of here, and we're going to do better. And it's like, okay, but you didn't say how you're going to do better, other than you're going to change the algorithm. There's got to be something more to it.
Well, and I would say what that points to is I have two thoughts about that. Yeah. One is, how do we measure success? If it's only the bottom line, is that really an appropriate measurement of success?
So how do you bring subjectivity into it?
Well, you have the guts to be subjective. Yeah. I mean, this is really, I think, what has happened in the digital era is kind of we've outsourced our brains to algorithms and spreadsheets and said, you see it in college admissions. It's like, if you check all these boxes, right, then you're in. And in fact, if you cannot, as a human being, exercise your intelligence, yes, sometimes you're going to make mistakes, but there is a judgment that you bring to things that an algorithm doesn't. The second thought I have is, I'm predicting right here that this is not the first time we're going to hear the algorithm made me do it.
No,
we're going to hear it again, aren't we?
We're definitely going to hear it again. I keep going, wait a minute, when did we give up our, we're sentient beings. When did we give up our own ability to be able to think rationally and with some sort of humanity about what we're doing? And we turn it over to the computers and say, okay, you guys figure it out. And it's like, no.
Because then you can blame the machine instead of taking responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Because the machine doesn't really think. You can blame the machine.
Or feel.
Right? The machine just does. Well, our next topic is about another sort of whitewashing and gender washing. Something somewhat similar yet totally unrelated happened at NPR this week. The network's news director issued a statement that, quote, disciplined, direct coverage of race relations and the culture wars has been lacking, even more than was realized. Well, the rank and file at NPR, to use their words, they were baffled and insulted by her statement, and more than 85 staffers, people of color, signed a memo in response saying that she had ignored their efforts over the past few years, pointing out the creation of programs with successful followings such as Code Switch and African Americans who have been hired and taken on very prominent on-air and behind-the-scenes roles. But this memo also said there is still room to grow, that while African Americans have had their profile elevated very highly at NPR, that the Latinx community and that the Latinx journalists have been largely left out of this growth.
Yeah, and there's some truth to that, and I know that they have been working in trying to do that, especially the Code Switch team and other programming, in particular the programming that's done on the weekends on NPR. I think this is a one of those situations where you had a relatively new leader at NPR who came in and is still trying to find her way, and was at a conference and felt like she needed to make a statement, and made it without thinking about it, or at least going, wait a minute, I need to do some homework on this. But I think, she could have got out of it by basically saying, look, we're doing great things, but we could do more, and then left it at that. But nope, she put the second sentence in, kept going, and didn't go well after that.
Yeah, that's sometimes what gets you in trouble, right? Not knowing when to stop talking.
Right.
You had mentioned she is relatively new in her position. There is somebody even newer now, the chief executive and the president, who has been brought over to NPR. He was announced this week coming from Voice of America. What do we perhaps know about him, or what he's going to be in a position to do to even better position NPR?
Well, I mean, I think he brings a lot of news background in, a lot of news judgment. What I'm going to be interested in is when he gets put into this mix, do they continue down the path where they're trying to show more diversity? And when I say diversity, it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's also about looking at it from a socioeconomic standpoint, looking at it from a geographical standpoint. I mean, NPR is really working with its affiliates to try to do more to reach certain areas and certain populations.
And KBIA has been instrumental in that with the Health and Wealth Desk, with Harvest Public Media.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get away from the reputation that NPR has had as being more East Coast, West Coast, more urban, and less paying attention to other regions of the country, like the Midwest.
Radio?
Well, absolutely. But I think they're heading in the right direction, and they're doing a good job. And it'll be interesting to see whether someone from the Voice of America, which is mainly seen as governmental, political, and that around that realm, able to continue along that same path.
Yeah, but I will say that Voice of America does some tremendous reporting. I mean, it is the Voice of America, but one of the things about the U.S., the publications that are published by the U.S. government, whether it's Voice of America or Stars and Stripes, the newspaper for the military, they are remarkably independent and have done some great work. So I don't think that somebody having that on his or her resume is a disqualifier.
Not at all.
And I think, as I say, I mean, as you said, Ernest, I think this gentleman's experience in news is what really counts here.
Okay, so the ripples haven't yet stopped forming since the jailing and death by suicide of financier Jeffrey Epstein. This week, those ripples extended into the halls of the Academy, where the director of MIT's Media Lab stepped down after taking Epstein's money, knowing at the time about his history. Joichi Ito went out of his way to conceal that knowledge, and now that's bringing a lot of shame onto that institution.
Yeah, and it is a shame because the MIT Media Lab has done some great work. And full disclosure, I have an old college friend who works there who does really cool work with a programming program that he's developed for children, and which Epstein falsely claimed to have funded. So I think what this really what it really emphasizes is how important it is for nonprofits to be transparent about the sources of their funding. And one of the most damning things about the New Yorker story on this was the details about the lengths to which MIT officials went to conceal Epstein's involvement. And, that's a sign of bad conscience. And the most stunning thing was the detail in the piece about people at MIT having these conversations with Epstein's air quotes assistants because they were worried that they were being trafficked, that these young women were being trafficked. And they're taking money from a guy like this. I just think it's so important for nonprofits to say this is where we get our money, and the discipline of having to do that, I think, will prevent this sort of disaster, public relations disaster. From
I also think the willingness to when they realize that that they have taken money from someone, to say, okay, we're gonna give it back. We're gonna give it to a charity that can help victims of this person. I mean, because quite often what happens is that these nonprofits and universities and others will take these donations, and then 3, 4, 5, or maybe even more years down the road, it's discovered that this person has been involved in some shady either business.
We experienced that here on our own campus with Kenneth Lay and the donations that he had made to the business school.
Right, before Enron imploded and all of that happened, and you have to be willing to say, okay, we see what's going on. We recognize this. We need to disavow ourselves from this person. If that means giving the money back, it means giving the money back.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. There was one story that I saw on the New York Times' website yesterday that, given today being September 11th, I wanted to pose the question to the two of you as we look back on this 18 years later. And journalists are looking for slightly different ways to cover it every year so that it's not the same story. And this piece that I saw yesterday was talking about the film industry and images of the Twin Towers in movies or television shows set pre 9/11. And the question that it asked, is it a tragic reminder or is it a tribute?
It's history.
It's history. Thank you. I was going to say
it's
the
history.
same thing. Yeah.
And you can't, you're not going to not show videos of Cologne in Germany before it was bombed by the Allies. I mean, it's the reality. To me, the best, I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. I had to interview a lot of 9/11 the spouses, the people who lost people on that day. And it is, I had not been back to Ground Zero until earlier this year. And when I went, I saw a beautiful building. I saw a farmer's market and the station. And I just thought there is no sweeter, better revenge than to see life on that spot. And that's the best memorial that we could ever have to 9/11.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's recognizing it, and for the historical part, but also don't forget that there was a tragic human loss there, and that also needs to be a part of the narrative.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time for this week. There were a lot of things we were planning on talking about that in the, 7 seconds before you're about to start hearing our music, there's no way we could get to. So I'm going to suggest that you go to our Links blog, read more about each of those stories. You can find that Links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We are also putting this program available for you on Facebook. You can find it on iTunes or Stitcher, any other place where you find your favorite podcast downloads. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments or questions. See previews of what we'll be talking about next week and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be with you next week.